Okay, so welcome again to today's webinar for our follower city Sabadell, which we are doing to support them with their replication process. Many representatives from our follower city Sabadell are present today. Most of all, Oriol is present, who is the city coordinator of the city of Sabadell. So welcome, Oriol, and thank you very much for co-organizing this webinar with me today. Okay, so buenos dias, Sabadell. So first, let me give you a brief introduction to Triangulum in case some of you have not heard of Triangulum before. Also, if you have any questions afterwards or in the meantime, you can always send me an email. My name is Bettina Remmele, and you can send an email to remmele@steinbeis-europa.de. Okay, so this is the agenda. I will start with a brief introduction to Triangulum in just a second. Then we will have 3 presentations. So we will start with presentation 2 by Vin Sumner from Clicks and Links Manchester, continue with Adrian Sledger from Manchester City Council, and then the last presentation will be done by Mark Cox from the Eindhoven University of Technology. He has some trouble with the internet connection, so we had to spontaneously switch the order of presentations. In between, we will always have 10 to 15 minutes time for questions. And then if there are some final questions in the end, of course, we will also have time for that. So let me briefly give you an introduction to Triangulum. So Triangulum is a project funded within the Horizon 2020 program by the European Commission. We have a project budget of 29 million euros, and 25 of these 29 million euros come from the Horizon 2020 program. Our consortium consists of 23 European partners in 6 countries, including municipalities, research institutes, and businesses. The project is coordinated by Fraunhofer IAO in Stuttgart, and it is supported by Steinbeis-Europa-Zentrum, which is also the company that I'm working for. The focus is on energy, mobility, and ICT, so each of our city implements solutions related to these 3 themes, so to speak. The duration of Triangulum is from February 2015, and it ends in January 2020, so that you can see that we are in the final year of our project, and therefore this webinar series is focusing on the replication process of our follower cities to really help them and support them with being successful in their replication. Here you see an overview of all the partners, so you can see that it is managed by Fraunhofer with support from Universität Stuttgart and Steinbeis-Europa-Zentrum. And then we have many partners in the 3 lighthouse cities, Eindhoven, Manchester, and Stavanger. And also the follower cities are represented with 1 partner each. And then we also have some specialists that work on or support the replication process, such as Fraunhofer Focus. Something else that's important to know is that Triangulum is not a standalone project, so we are a part of currently 14 European Smart City Lighthouse projects, which are all funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 program. So some of them are, so you see Triangulum at the top left corner, and Remo Urban and Gross Marta are the 2 other projects that started in 2015 with us and which are ending at the beginning of next year. And at the very bottom, you see the 2 latest additions to the family, so to speak, Positive City Exchange and Making City. They have just started at the end of last year, so they have many years left to implement their solutions. The 3 lighthouse cities of Triangulum are Manchester, Eindhoven, and Stavanger, so we also have a nice geographical spread. And in all these 3 cities, in the first 3 years of the project, different innovative solutions have been implemented, and the 3 follower cities, which are Prague, Sabadell, and Leipzig, are now trying to replicate these solutions, or some of them, or in different ways, in their own cities. Okay, so this was the brief introduction to Triangulum. We will now start, I will now give the moderator rights to Vin Sumner by clicks and links in just a second so that he can start with his presentation. But briefly, let me talk a little bit more about the sense of this webinar. So in Triangulum, we decided that every follower cities should have the chance to shape the content of at least one webinar to their own liking, where they can ask for specific topics, or as it is the case with Sabadell, several different topics that they are interested in, and where they feel like they would still need some more input from the lighthouse cities. So Sabadell chose the 3 topics: green mobility, 4 and 2 schools, which will be covered by Mark Cox at the end of this webinar. Then they are interested in city visualization technologies, which will be the presentation by Vin Sumner in just a second. And they're interested in Internet of Things, which will be covered by Adrian Sledger from the Manchester City Council. The 3 speakers today are from our lighthouse cities, Manchester and Eindhoven, and they will talk about these different topics and provide some more details from their own experience. Every presentation will last about 20 to 30 minutes, and afterwards we will have some time to ask questions or comment on the presentations. For these question sessions, I would like to ask you to please mention in the chat box if you have a question, and then I will give you speaker rights so that not all of us are speaking at the same time. But I will mention this later on again. Are there any questions at this point related to the general organization of the webinar? Okay, everything seems clear. That's great. So let me start by introducing the first speaker to you. So the first speaker today will be Vin Sumner, who will talk about city visualization technologies. Vin is the CEO of Clicks and Links, which is one of the local partners in our lighthouse city, Manchester. And Clicks and Links is an SME, so a small to medium enterprise specializing in visualization technologies such as virtual reality. As part of our Lighthouse City Manchester, Clicks and Links has been looking at city data, visualization techniques, and innovation challenges. Today, his talk will be about the rise of digital twins and visualization technologies in cities. So thank you for your presentation, Vin. I will make you a moderator now, and then you can start your presentation by sharing your own screen. Okay, you can go ahead then.
Hello, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Good morning, everybody. Vin Sumner from Clicks and Links. I guess the easiest way is to take questions at the end, but if there's some burning question during the presentation, then we'll try and answer that. I'm going to talk for probably 20 minutes or so about topics around city data and visualization and the sorts of technologies that are being used. It's quite wide-ranging, but we can pick up on any detail points later. So if I have to get the presentation to go, yeah. I like this phrase. Tell me now, forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I may learn, and I learn. And a lot of the technology we're looking at now around visualization, virtual reality, are actually very much involving people in experiences, and that's a way that engages people much more than just looking at something. So I think that's quite an important aspect of some of these technologies, that they're much more experiential, you're part of, rather than just looking at a screen quite often. And that quite nicely links, and I'll come back to bikes. I know it's something that's particularly of interest to Sabadell, but typically you don't learn to ride a bike by reading guidelines, and these notes actually are from the UK NHS National Health Service, which tell you how to ride a bike. Most people probably learn to ride a bike by getting on a bike and falling off a few times and such like. So they're involved by doing. And I think the sorts of technologies I'm going to talk about enable much more of that. So how you might experience a city, how you might experience a city in the future, how you might experience a city in different circumstances, good, bad, whatever there might be. So I think we're moving towards that possibility that you can ask those sorts of questions. So rather than just looking at some screen or some papers. So to try and cover this ground, I'm going to give a quick introduction. I'm going to talk about city digital models and digital twins, and then a term that we use called canvases. I'll talk a bit about the technology that's now coming available, things like virtual reality, and then particularly focus at the end around example use case, which is around cycling. There's a couple more demonstration videos that I have as well as part of the slide set, but may well leave those for you to look at in good time. So to introduce the topic, I think what's really important before we talk about visualization is just the idea that a city should have some digital representation of itself. If it has that, then it can do a lot of things. And what do I mean by that? I mean a representation of the city as it is today, but how it's changing over time. So I don't just mean the physical buildings, but also the processes that are going on, the traffic movement, the people movement, all those sorts of things. If you have that digital representation, then you can start to ask all sorts of questions about what if, how about this, what if I change this, what if I change that. The term digital twin is becoming used quite a lot for this kind of smart, people might say, 3D representation of the city. Digital twin is probably coming a bit like smart cities. It'll be used everywhere and it will mean different things to different people. Within that term, there's going to be things like multiple levels of detail. There's not only one level of detail that you would want to represent a city at, depending on what you're doing. If you're thinking about the engineering aspects of a city, the way things work, then that's a different level of detail than if you're thinking about the citizen experience of a city, which is very, very different. So even within the term digital twin, there'll be lots of different levels of detail. Visualization is, I think, a key part of it. Probably the big aspect of a digital twin is that you can visualize a city, you can experience a city in some form, in a digital way rather than the real way. Digital twins, digital representations lead to lots of different use cases, from operational management of the city to planning, to how citizens might want to see their city developing, and it opens all sorts of possibilities. Those questions I was asking earlier, things like, what would it be like if? What is it like in a certain circumstance? Even I think in the future, people might decide where to live depending on what a place might be like on particular days or particular times of the year and things like that. And you start to be able to get to that sort of capability. The new technologies that have come in the last 3 or 4 years, such as augmented reality, virtual reality, help to present the city to people in different ways. I think what's really important with those technologies is that they're used appropriately, as opposed to just being used because they're new. Before you can visualize a city or in any sensible way, it's really important, and I won't go into vast detail on this slide, that there is some digital model, there is some understanding of what the city is about, and there's some in the light agreement about how you're going to represent the city. If one person is talking about signposts and somebody else is talking about direction indicators, even the language has to be right. So you need things to think about, things like city ontologies, which describe the words that we're going to use to describe the city. If you don't have those sort of common standards and things like that, then it becomes much more difficult to present and engage with the city. So there's a whole lot of potential users and lots of different ways of presenting the city, both in its current state, how it was in the past, and how it might be in the future. And an important aspect of that is what we would call data curation. So the data of the city, in my mind, needs to be looked after by somebody in the same way as a library looks after books. And if you have good data curation, it means that people can be confident in the city. So if I want to use a 3D model of the city, I know it's the right one. If I'm going to do some planning, I know I'm using the right data. At the moment, I think there are lots of different approaches to this. There are public authorities that are trying to do data curation. There are commercial companies trying to do it. There are, to some degree, large organizations like Google do it. But I think a really important thing for any public authority is to think how they're going to approach data curation. They don't mean they have to do everything. They just have to have an approach to city data so that people who want to use it can be confident that it's up to date and correct and all those sorts of things. There are open source models, there are more private models, but I think the important thing is that the issue is addressed. Otherwise, all the clever visualization and things like that we can do will be built on weak foundations. These webinars are quite strange in the sense that you feel like you're talking to no one because you can't hear anything back. But I'm just assuming that people are listening and that my voice is clear enough.
Yes, we can hear you just well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's just checking sometime that there's somebody at the other end, really. Please shout if there's something misunderstandings. So digital twin, there are increasing number of definitions, but a digital twin is a smart 3D model of the city that accurately represents the streets, buildings, public spaces, and so on of the physical city. The intelligence unleashed by the digital twin enables city to improve their physical and social urban environment. I think all those things are right, but inside those words, there are all sorts of challenges. I mean, accurately represents the streets, buildings, but yeah, accuracy depends on the use. So what you'll find is different levels of detail, as I mentioned before, for different purposes. If you want detail that enables you to walk around the city, that's one level of detail. If you want detail that enables people to do engineering, build new roads or bridges, whatever it would be, that's somewhat different level of detail. But the principle is the same, that we're trying to represent the city digitally so we can do good things to enable the city to improve. And digital twins need to be scalable. They need to allow us to be able to give access not just to what's there today, but also what's happening. So access to real-time data. So there are the examples in industry these days are coming from large organisations, people who manufacture cars, people in the UK, people like Jaguar Land Rover, who have digital twins of not just all their buildings, but all the processes that go on within that organisation, so they can test things out. So I think the phrase at the bottom there, a window on the developing project, city and legacy, it's those sort of things. You've got a window on aspects of the city. I like to use the term canvas because what digital twin does is give us a opportunity to present the city in lots of different ways. An artist would paint on a canvas. So you can use different sorts of presentation techniques. Some of it could be 2D maps. Some of it could be, for instance, a 3D point cloud. So that's data that you gather from taking from photogrammetry. So for those who maybe not clear, photogrammetry is when you take lots of 2D photographs of a city or buildings or such like, and then from that you can effectively create a 3D model of the place. UK, the Ordnance Survey, the mapping agency, do a lot of city photogrammetry and create point clouds from that. You would have canvases that would include asset data of the city, and then also canvases would include things like 3D models of buildings. Some of those might be simply the outside of buildings, some might be more detailed canvases that include the inside. And then obviously today there's a lot more aerial photography from drones and other means. So there's lots of different ways in which we can present data. And what that means in a sense is that any particular application, and this one's an example maybe of accessing IoT data, I'll come back to a cycling example of this, that you can present that data on a 2D map, you might present it in a 3D application, and you can also present it immersively in something like virtual reality. So you want to be looking at data in different ways. Sometimes I think because we do virtual reality, people think that all we want to do is put a headset on somebody and that's the application. To my mind, that's the opposite of what we need to do. We need to be looking at data, and then when we think something like immersive technology is the right one, then use it at that point and only that point when it becomes valuable. So there's lots of different ways of visualizing data, and we use the right one at the right time, and that's the kind of canvas approach that I would promote. And these couple of diagrams kind of show that we're trying to layer data about the city on models, and we can then start to manipulate that data and ask questions about what if we change this, what if we change that, what would the experience be? Some very powerful things, because experiential answers to questions are much more powerful than just saying to people, what do you think? If they actually do something, you can see them do something, how they react to a new cycleway or a new crossing or something like that, then you can actually see that taking place. So I flipped through a few slides of different sorts of visualizations of cities. Some of these come from a sister project that was done in Manchester to Triangulum. I think Adrian might talk more about it later, called City Verve, which focused on IoT, working very closely with Ordnance Survey, I said, the mapping agency here. And it's some examples of data presentation. This is a virtual reality presentation on a sort of desktop table of energy data from Manchester. Actually, if we collaborate around a table in virtual reality, looking at what's going on in the city. This example here is it's actually a point cloud, which we've used. I think some of you, particularly the people from Sabadell, know of our VR bike. We've used point clouds for people to cycle around parts of the city and get an experience of what that would be like. Again, tabletop presentation. So lots of things you can start to do in terms of presenting visual data of the city. If you've got some way of curating it and coordinating it. Lots of new technologies around. I'm not going to go into them in detail. Don't forget, we can simply present things on screens in 2 and 3D. You can use interactive 360 video now. A lot of that's going on in tourism. So what would it be like to go to a particular place? So what would it be like to go to Sabadell or wherever it would be? What would the experience be? Things like augmented, mixed reality, virtual reality. Experiential visualization, I use the term, it's really virtual reality, but it's really saying what would a place be like, and not just what would it be like in one circumstance, but what would it be like if it was raining? What would it be like if it was sunny? What would it be like if the football games going on or whatever it would be. So you can ask lots of different questions. Bottom one there, I think some of you may have come across them, those portable caves that people use to, again, tourism cities use them to sort of like projection systems. You stand in the middle of a room and there's things are projected onto all the walls, and it makes you feel like you're in that place. So lots of different technologies. I think the key message I would say on all this is that they should be used appropriately. I'll flick past these couple of slides. They just like present where these different realities appear. There's lots of confusion about that at times. If you want people to be really immersed in something, then virtual reality. If it's less about immersion but more about the real world, then augmented reality tends to be the favoured technology. These are what people are looking at. I think one of the things just to say in this area of technology is headsets and various devices like this will get cheaper, faster, smaller, as everything does. In a few years' time, the headsets will be much more like glasses or even contact lenses. And the key thing there will be the power of the data that you're looking at. So if you can organise the data city now, you can actually make use of technology as it moves forward. I'll flip the hardware slide. I just wanted to talk a little bit about an example of bringing this sort of technology together from Manchester, and trying to ask the question about cycling. And what we did here was we actually used 3 different sorts of presentation. One, simply on a 2D map, looking at what's currently going on, where people are cycling from sensor data. If you've got that, then you can start to ask questions about why maybe you want to change things, that there's too many people cycling here or there's not enough people cycling there. Then from looking at a 3D model of the area, you can start to say, how might I want to change things? What do I want to put a new junction in? How do I want to model that, etc. And then you can start to ask questions of cyclists and people by saying, okay, I'm going to make this change. What do you think of it? So if you were cycling down this route, would you follow the cycle lane, or would you break out into the main road like lots of people often do? You know, how would you interact with pedestrians, etc. So there's an example here really of using 3 different sorts of my canvases: a 2D map, 3D model for the planning, and then immersive virtual reality to ask people about what the experience would be like. And say ask people. The great thing about things like immersive virtual reality is that you can watch people. You can see what they do, where they go, rather than necessarily the older style consultation where you might just say, what do you think of that? You've actually seen it. So skip that one, I think. So again, this is just really going back into those 3 parts. The 2D map gives us that sort of awareness. The 3D application identifies some actions that you want to take, and then the immersive VR engages with people. And I think this is increasingly how cities will want to engage with their cities, not just about cycling, but lots of different things. So if we do this, what would it be like? Can I have your reaction to it before we start to build it? Infrastructure clearly is expensive, takes time, lasts a long time as well. So you want to make the right decisions rather than having to try and change things in the future. That's a picture of our kind of VR bike, which I think we did visit Sabadell back last year, and very grateful that we won a innovation prize over there. Hopefully it will come back at some form in the near future. So I'll just play a quick video. Play, I think, of this, the sort of thing I mean by the VR bike. This is you'll see the person on the bike in the bottom corner, and there's some commentary. But in this particular case, you're cycling through a laser scan point cloud of a part of Manchester, and basically, as you cycle, whatever speed you cycle at, you move through at that pace. And if you turn, you can get some good coaching here to take it easy at the start. But that gives you a sort of idea of how we're using these technologies to give people experience of new things, or to show them around the city to get from A to B. So I think I lost the presentation slightly there. Come back. Yeah, so some more pictures of that. And I think I want to skip those last two slides. I just wanted to show you one final short video. It's about property, so it's related to cities, but it's quite a simple example. It's really a property in the woods, but it shows you how you can start to visualize things and make them look really like photorealistic, in a sense. So this is a video of a virtual reality application. Imagine you could create your city like this with all the soft textures and things that you could show, particularly things like tourism and things like that. You could show off something. And this is not a video. This is a model, which means that you can move wherever you want to go. You can go around it. And what you can also do is you can switch things on and off. So if I move further down, you'll see I can actually have it raining. I can have the sun out and things like that. And so this is where these sorts of technologies are taking us, so that we can actually create experience of places that are very different over different periods of time, and they can react to what the person wants to. So I think I've probably used up my 20 minutes plus. It's a bit of a quick run through visualization technology of varying sorts. I hope it was of interest, and happy to take some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Finn, for your presentation. It was very interesting to learn more about digital twins and how they help cities to develop further. So thank you very much. I saw that there is already one question by Nick Castle. Nick, would you like to speak up to ask your question in person? I'll give you some speaker rights.
Thanks, Vin, for the presentation. Just curious, because it's very interesting what you're saying about the layers of data and so on. And you mentioned briefly about the car company, Jag your Land Rover, having data. I wasn't clear if they were actually, you were working with them and they were sharing some data with you, or you were just using that as a more general example of development techniques.
No, it was more of an example. I think industry, everyone is to some degree talking about digital twins at the moment. It's become a little bit perhaps of a marketing term as well, but some manufacturing organizations have kind of taken it very seriously, and Jag your Land Rover, I think, are a good example of that they have models of all their processes, their plants and things like that, so they can ask questions of their production line digitally, if you like. You know, what if I do that? What if I do this? And so it's not just they have 3D models of all their facilities, but then they have the model of how they operate as well. So whereas I think a lot of cities at the moment, you might find city models in 3D but quite static. You don't have that many where you can actually see the city operating in a sense and ask questions of it.
Okay, thanks.
It was very referenced by example, really. Yeah.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Yes, Bettina, this is Oriol from Sabadell.
Yeah.
Hi, Oriol.
Just first, hello, Vin. Thanks for the.
Hi.
It has been very interesting and certainly not only with this presentation, but all the knowledge that you are transferring us throughout Triangulum. It's really useful for us. Well, I would have many comments, but well, more or less you know our approach. We are continue to work in developing new use cases. We have the idea of the 3D model of Sabadell. Also to the work already done in the VR bike, I think should be also continued, and also trying to involve the schools and actually connecting it to the other topic that we have today, the topic of how to move to schools and from schools by bike. So I think that there is a potential there. Sure. And well, yeah, that was just in general. All your presentation was very enlightening. Yeah, from the general philosophy of saying if you want to involve, if you want to learn, you have to involve people, and you really and these technologies are really helping people to get involved and to do these simulations of how the future will be. But just to concretize it into a question, I would say we have also a team in the municipality who is working in the field of building information modeling. Sure. And we have been recently approached by them. They are doing like, for example, when redesigning a square or a street, they are modeling it before through this BIM technology, this BIM software. And well, how could it be connected with what you are doing to a certain extent would be my question. How BIM is if it has any connection with this with your work.
I think very definitely. In many ways, BIM is you know, the visualization of buildings. So you know that there's a common way of viewing them from when they were originally designed through their building and to maintenance and things like that. A city is an aggregation of buildings, and the data that you get from BIM should be usable as part of city models. That's for sure. I think one of the things just to always be careful of is the levels of detail. You know, a lot of BIM comes from very detailed CAD models, computer-aided design models of buildings, and depending on what you're doing, you may not need that level of detail. For instance, if you had some buildings in the square and you had all the detailed BIM data, but your use case was cycling around the square, you wouldn't need all the detailed data of the bolts and wires in the building, which the BIM model would have. So that's why it's really important to understand the use case and what level of detail you have. What is increasingly happening is people are looking at ways of, you know, extracting the right level of detail. So you could use the BIM model, but I just use the outside facades of the buildings rather than what's going on inside them. So it's an important part of the whole model, and that source of data. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Oriol?
Yeah. Perfectly. Thanks. Also, if the others, I know that there are other people from Sabadell who joined online. I see Katrina, Uriol, Roger, and others who join us spontaneously. If you want to ask any other question.
Yeah, if anybody else has a question, you can either just unmute yourself and start speaking, or if that's not possible, let me know in the chat window.
Or equally, feel free at another stage to email me. I can answer questions.
Do we have time for another question, Betty?
Yeah, we have time.
We move to the. Yeah, just it's not about maybe not connected to your presentation, but it is also in our follower city implementation strategy. It's the topic of well, we call it taking the name of Eindhoven solution, the city beacons, but in general it's about installing screens in the public space where information is shown in a very visual way about the city in an interactive way. Do you have any feedback on this or any knowledge on these city screens, whether we should invest into that or in the end these screens are not very much used by people?
I can give you a personal answer then, and maybe, I mean, Adrian from the City Council of Manchester might be able to give a more specific comment from the Manchester's perspective. I mean, I think they kind of have value, these screens, in certain circumstances, but I think they are often can be quite expensive and kind of run out of use quickly if you're not careful. So I think finding ways of making them last longer, I think is and that's through having the right sort of data. I mean, it is quite easy. I mean, I think a few years ago, kiosks, I think, with, you know, the little kiosks were very popular everywhere, but they seem to have sort of, you know, disappeared because people get all that information from their phone now and things like that. So I think big screens are, I think, perhaps a good marketing tool for certain circumstances, but I think you have to think carefully about what you're trying to convey to people. I don't know, Adrian, you might have a City Council view.
Hi there. Yeah, I'd probably agree with that. Really, it's I'd say that when you have a kind of kiosk, what it really is an interactive notice board. When you go to a bus stop, you want to look at the bus times. You don't necessarily want to look at other information. And a paper-based one works very well. People use it and they update it when the bus timetables change. But that's only every 3 or 4 months. For real-time information, we look at our phones. I will talk a little bit about this in my presentation, a little bit about different types of interfaces, because I think it's really about user design. I think, unfortunately, a lot of kiosks have been developed with the idea that we should have something there rather than actually what people actually want in their city. And I think that's really where your starting point should be. You know, I do think they actually work sometimes quite well within buildings. You know, so if you're in a cinema or somewhere like that and you're wanting to see what's on, or if you're at a conference venue and you're wanting to find your way around, or even in a shopping centre, there's some good interactive displays if you're trying to find where a particular shop is. But I think in the public space, there's a mismatch between the information that's provided and the user interface.
Thanks, Adrian.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for asking questions, and of course, Vin, for your very nice presentation. So we still also have some time at the end of this webinar. So if you come up with some further questions to Vin, please write them down and you can then ask them at the end of this webinar, or you can also always just post them in the chat box and we will get back to them later. So let me now introduce the second speaker of today to you. We have already heard him just now. It's Adrian Slatcher. He will talk about IoT, so the Internet of Things. And Adrian is the Principal Resource and Programs Officer at the Manchester City Council, where he has been working since 2003.
Right.
He has managed a number of European innovation projects, and he currently focuses his work on the project CityVerve, which is Manchester's IoT demonstrator. Adrian is specialized in smart cities, open data, and living labs. And amongst other things, today he will speak about why IoT will become increasingly important in the future and why it is so crucial to include the human factor in any discussions related to this topic as well. So Adrian, I will give you now the moderator rights, and then you can share your screen and start with your presentation.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Let me just get to the right screen. To do it the other way around. Right, so I should be sharing my screen now, and it should be an orange presentation.
Yeah, exactly. It's working.
Okay, thank you, Bettina. Thank you for inviting me to this presentation. I've not worked directly on Triangulum, but it's my colleagues have been working on it for the last 4.5 years, and I've been aware of it throughout. And I'm pleased to say they've often asked me if I wanted to, if they need some information about digital aspects or Internet of Things, they have come to me for that conversation. The City of Earth project saw Manchester chosen as the Internet of Things demonstrator for the UK. So it was a substantial project, but it took place over a 2-year period and finished in June last year. We've had a slight continuation where we've been evaluating some of the aspects of it. So this opportunity to speak to you is very timely. But I'm not going to talk about the particular project or the follow-on project, Synchronicity, which is EU funded, another IoT demonstrator working with 8 European cities. I'm not going to talk about them specifically because I realise that Internet of Things is something that is outside the usual experience of most city councils because it's a jargon, it's a technical term, and it's often seen as something that comes from the digital sector, the digital marketplace. So I'm going to try and explain why IoT is important to cities and some of our learnings from working on these projects really for the last 3 or 4 years. So first of all, I'm going to cover why I think IoT is important to cities and just a brief explanation of what I think Internet of Things is. I'll talk about the different elements of IoT in a smart city. I think critical, it's one of those areas that you are always going to be working with the private sector, with universities, with researchers, and with community organisations, hopefully. And so I'll talk a little bit about the IoT ecosystem and how that is so critical to making this work in your own city or your own region. I'll also then carry on and talk a little bit about the current status and future trends, where I see where we're at the moment from our experience over the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm going to finish off with some lessons learned, very much thinking of the replication. How do you look at this from a citywide perspective if you are being approached to use Internet of Things in your city? So first of all, I realise people have different levels of understanding of this technology. IoT, Internet of Things, is a catch-all term. It refers to how devices, sensors, and other things can be digitally connected, enabling real-time control and monitoring, the sharing of data, and remote or wireless operation. A friend of mine did a presentation a couple of years ago where he very succinctly says, all the things that are currently connected by a wire, you take the wire away, and then it gives you so much more freedom about where you place things, how you use things, and the things you can do. We all know from our own experience of living in a city that where we have to be tethered to a desk or be in a particular place to do a particular action, it means we do things in a certain way. Now, a lot of the use of IoT and the reason it's been developed is to give kind of digital capability and capacity to those tasks that can't take place tethered to a desk. I guess some of the more mature uses of this are in areas such as manufacturing, logistics, agricultural business. People use it a lot for, say, monitoring of the smart grid, so knowing when the pipes on the grid are working correctly, or using it for tracking things within logistics. Whenever you get a parcel delivered in the UK now, the chances are there will be a tracker attached to that, So you'll be able to know where your delivery is at. When Amazon deliver to my address now, they say your delivery driver is 5 stops away and places it on the map. So it enables you to give a level of control, a level of understanding, and a level of monitoring that wasn't possible before. So obviously companies who are dealing with Internet of Things as a solution want to provide the service where there is actually a market for it. And a lot of those markets are within the consumer world, the retail world, the manufacturing world, where they know that there is a replicable service that they can do time and time again. I think my first understanding of Internet of Things came from such examples, hearing about how you might be tracking food from production to destination, for instance. Or similarly, rather than having a system where you had to send people out to check whether it was working correctly, whether it's smart street lights or the electrical systems under the ground, that there were some devices, some sensors that enabled you to update in real time when something was not working. So smart cities do offer a further market for Internet of Things, but it's a market that hasn't quite developed as fast perhaps as the suppliers would want. And I think for us as cities, we want to understand what are the opportunities in that and also what are the limitations. I think it's important to cities because our citizens are used to having the information they want at the time they want it, via banking, entertainment, news and retail, via their mobile devices. Increasingly, we're beginning to see this come into the home. People are using it to control their heating system so that they can switch the heat on when they're on the way back home or change the settings remotely. Or through smart doorbells, where people can actually see who is coming to their door, whether or not they are in the house or not. So there's lots of different use cases that are being developed, and many of the services that you deliver in the cities may actually benefit from utilising IoT. But I think it's important to say they may benefit. There are some challenges about the deployment, about the design, and I guess again, the cost. So when I talk about Internet of Things, as I say, it is a catch-all technology. It isn't just a single thing like a device or a sensor. It is all these things together. I've tried to kind of simplify this by saying Internet of Things has 6 different aspects to it. I start with the most complex one and the one which is perhaps hardest for us to point to and say we've actually got that, a platform. Now in this context, a platform could well be the back office system that connects our various Internet of Things devices. The American company Gartner, who does a hype cycle of emerging technologies, which is often used in presentations such as this, the IoT platform is at the peak of expectations now, which means that it is going to almost certainly disappoint and go into a trough of disillusionment where the platforms that have been proposed do not solve the problems they were meant to address. I think it's quite interesting that that's the one IoT element that is in the current Gartner hype cycle. I think it sees that a lot of companies have been pushing the idea of a single platform as being the answer to your smart city problems. I think when we use the term platform from a city point of view, it is useful though, because what we are talking about is the interoperability of new systems with our existing back office systems to give us a seamless control experience that can actually improve our efficiency and improve our service. Connectivity is really important with Internet of Things and is often a barrier to adoption. I use the example, if you were an e-commerce company trying to set up an online shop, you do not have to create the internet every time you do so. You can just go on to the internet, set up a website, and everything is there. And you can guarantee that if people are looking for you, they will be able to find you. If you've got something they want to buy, you'll be able to sell it to them. You don't have to create the infrastructure in order for you to do that. In the case of connectivity for IoT, we either do have to create the infrastructure, or we have to use the proprietary systems that are already in place. So different countries and different cities will have different mobile operators who may have a monopoly or may have a concession. So to guarantee that connectivity across a city, rather than in a building where we have a bit more control, we might need to use a particular provider's 3G network or 4G network. There are also good reasons with IoT not to use these levels of connectivity. That there are low data transmission mechanisms. LoRa is a particular one. Sigfox is a kind of version of that. Zigbee is a kind of local network. There are many, many more of these local protocols. What they mean is that it's very easy to transmit small amounts of data, a few bytes each time, from a sensor to a server to actually say what is going on at a particular place. This is very important and very useful, because if you've got a remote sensor, whether it's checking for air quality or proximity or any of these other things that sensors can check for, they are likely to be not always having an independent power supply, so be reliant on batteries, and having this low level of connectivity enables them to actually transmit for a longer period of time. Within cities, I've seen examples in some parts of the world where a city is just putting its own LoRa or similar networks in and then enabling people to use this. There are kind of some open source examples, a community-based thing called the Things Network, which does similar. And of course, there are companies, quite large companies, who are willing to put what things in and run it all for you. Now, the sensors themselves can be a wide range of different devices. Many sensors are very tiny, very small. You can order off the internet. You can get thousands of them installed relatively cheaply. But it depends what you're trying to measure. If you're trying to measure air quality, you probably need a high quality sensor to do so, and that can be expensive. It can require regular calibration. But if you're just trying to identify motion, so if you want to know if a street light can come on only when someone passes it, then a motion sensor might be very small, very cheap. You can't talk about Internet of Things without talking about data. The data that we pass between devices might be very small. It might just be a reading at a particular point in time. But if you have 1,000 devices, 1,000 devices are transmitting information every few minutes, it becomes a lot of data. So you need to have a plan around that. You need to be able to store that data. You need to be able to interrogate it. I mentioned when Vin was speaking about the importance of interfaces. I think Vin talked about canvases, the idea that what you see in the visualization can appear on different types of devices, 2D, 3D, etc. Our mobile phones, our laptops and our tablets are one way of looking at things. But we're increasingly seeing touch screens. And within people's homes, voice recognition, for instance, things like Alexa and Siri are becoming ubiquitous amongst certain applications in order to ensure that the way that we interface with the internet, with data, is actually not by pressing a screen, but actually by talking to it. So all of these elements is what makes IoT quite complicated, because you'd probably need all 6 of these in place for any particular application. And obviously that can be expensive, or it can be quite challenging to understand. This is why it's really important that your city or your area has what I would call an IoT ecosystem. It's not something we can build by ourselves as a local authority. We don't have the skills, the systems, or the resource to do so. We need systems integrators. These could be big companies, smaller companies, or they could be specialists. They might be providing the platforms and services to ensure the systems run in real time. That might include cloud computing, for instance, where you actually pay by the microsecond for the time that you use Amazon Web Services or whatever else you're using. It's also about the device manufacturers. I think in cities, most of the things we buy that could be enabled are actually things. You know, whether it's a bin, a vehicle, it might be a street light or a traffic light. Any of these items which were mechanical, controlled through electronics, can actually be enhanced and possibly improved by adding digital connectivity. But the companies we're working with will no doubt charge a premium for this, and we need to see if what we're actually getting is actually going to improve the service. Software providers are going to be required to write the interfaces, to do the clever bits behind the scenes. And when we get the data, when we actually find that our city is providing us with data that is talking to us, if you like, we need to understand what it's saying. And so I think actually working with our universities and working with specialist companies around data analysis is one way that we can actually really understand how we can use data from this IoT system to provide insight. I think what was interesting on CityVerve, it was a 2-year project, and we spent most of that 2 years, Vin was a partner on it, trying to put things in place. And he made a very good point, I think, that you can do a nice pretty visualization. If the underlying data is not that reliable, then what it actually shows can have a limited value. And so what we would really have liked, I think, is another couple of years, a bit like with the Lighthouse projects like Triangulum, to be able to kind of analyse how things were working in situ and what we learned from that. Also, I think we are based in a world which is very much seeing us as a client to the city and the people we buy from as our suppliers. What you actually find is the market tries to provide solutions, but they make their business case based upon a solution that can be replicated from city to city, a one-size-fits-all model. Also, within this area, a lot of companies will want to run the whole service for us. It might be they have some brilliant sensors, but their data analysts or their software interfaces might not be great. It might be brilliant doing this for a particular service. You might essentially buy a smart parking solution that replaces your old parking meters, or smart bins which tell you when they're full, and that becomes part of the solution. But if we begin to run a whole range of services, is it a case that we've then got 10 different platforms, 10 different suppliers, 10 different protocols? This is why we as cities need to have a think about how we architect and develop our own Internet of Things platform. Some are commercially available, others are open source. Some are made for particular industries. I think a colleague mentioned about BIM as a good example. And BIM is quite a mature market, so it's an area where there are already platforms in place which you might want to look at. So, for me, cities need to think, instead of a single platform, of the different building blocks to create something that will work for them. To make the systems interoperable, and the way you do that, I think, is using standards, many of which are available and are shared quite readily. And also, I think you want to avoid vendor lock-in or even city lock-in, where you are stuck in a particular development cycle that might have been a good idea when you made the decision, but 3-5 years down the line, it doesn't suit what you're trying to do. So I think it's really important that cities have an understanding of what they're trying to achieve, to develop their capabilities in this area, even in case of not necessarily doing it themselves, but having a plan. I think we also have to consider that we are the responsible people when it comes to security, privacy and trust. And we should build this in from the very start. There's a phrase that is used in digital sector called security by design. In other words, you don't think of security as an add-on that you do at the last minute, but you design your solution, your software, your platform with security built in from day one. We found, working with a lot of bigger companies as well as smaller companies, that bigger companies had some great understanding of security in terms of their systems, about hacking those systems and making sure the data on it was it made available in a way that was encrypted. But at the same time, they didn't really understand the human element quite so well, that there are certain things that we are restricted on what we can do in a city for regulatory reasons and other reasons. So it's not just a simple answer to your questions. We're going to put lots of cameras around the city and then use that data to kind of decide how the city is running. There will be other legal and regulatory considerations, and that needs to be thought about before you begin on this journey. I do think we want a scalable platform, likely to be cloud-based, and it needs to be designed to address our needs. I realise I haven't got much time left, so I'm just going to try and give you a couple of examples. We've worked on a lot of pilot schemes, and we've seen lots of pilot schemes from our partners elsewhere. A few examples would be air quality monitoring, home monitoring, where sensors are used for vulnerable adults. In other words, you put some sensors in a person's home with their permission to do so, and it checks to see if they are if they've got out of bed in the morning, if there's movement, checks if there's a fall, checks if the house is too cold. And the reason behind that is we're wanting to improve people's quality of life and stop them going into hospital. Smart parking, rather than have cars going round and round in the city trying to find a space, what if the parking space could be made available in advance, and as soon as someone leaves, someone else can come and take its place and kind of book it. Now, there are challenges with that. Similarly, we can use sensors for road and vehicle maintenance, which can be useful when we're looking at potholes and all those infrastructure demands on a city. And we can also do things around smart bins. The technology is here. It's very easy to deploy, but can we deploy it at scale? Have we got the right systems in place? It might be that procurement means that we're in a cycle with a particular supplier, and we would need to change the way that we ask for those services in order to make this change. I think business case is really important. We know there's a business case on replacing your street lights with LED lighting, but there might not be a business case around the smart parking application. The upfront cost of the sensors might be quite small, but it might be over a period of time that cloud computing, real-time processing could be quite costly. At a consumer level, we buy things for 2-3 years and then we buy a new one. As a city, we can't do that. We need something that can be updated, and IoT in some ways can help us with that, but we need to make sure we develop that when we're building the system. And yeah, the things I talked about earlier about connectivity and making sure it integrates with our existing systems. Now, we know that in the future, these are some of the trends that are quite close to where we are at the moment. Devices can be taught, so those cameras can learn more about their environment. I think when we talk about artificial intelligence, there's a question about where it fits with IoT, really. Artificial intelligence requires a lot of computing power. It also requires, I guess, in a sense, Internet of Things feeds into AI. It becomes part of the data that can power the machine. We have to think about our city's connectivity. Have we got enough? Are we ready for 5G as it emerges? Is 5G going to be something that actually makes a change, or is it very much something that is going to be expensive, which doesn't add the value that we want? And my experience is that whatever you try and do, there are lots of different people in your city doing similar things or different things in different areas. Your transport people might be doing something. Your buildings people might be doing something. So can we make our systems plug and play? I'd also like to see far more done with touchscreens, voice activation. And these can be great for digital inclusion. And in the kind of creative sphere, we're seeing some great things done, but we're not really seeing much movement on this at a local level. And I'd really like to see more done in that area. So I'm going to just conclude by saying, from my experience, that we are at an interesting point. I think most things are possible, but I think we as cities need to be very much in dialogue with our providers, because they will be developing their services based upon something they believe they can sell, and they may not be as innovative as we would want them to be. They may not really understand what our problems are, and yet IoT can be part of the mix. We do need to develop capacity, and that might be within your IT department, but also around the people at heads of services, seeing what is available, how things can be improved by using a digital aspect. If you've got local universities, local companies, it can be very helpful. And I think there is a strong role for standards and knowledge sharing in order us to make a better, I suppose, marketplace for everybody. I mentioned security, very important. I think a platform approach can make it much easier to deploy new services, but I'm not seeing anyone doing it absolutely brilliantly yet. We've tried it and it's complicated. And we try to have quite a loose platform, a platform of platforms, if you like. I think one of the problems is the market is based around vertical services, which are optimized for parking or optimized for traffic lights, and that for good reason. But we need to actually discover what it is that is a commonplace amongst these services. And I think IoT is only one part of our technology mix. For instance, when we were doing our home monitoring trial, the key thing to make it work was working with our community alarm service, who were able to, they had trust and they had experience, and they could install the equipment, and they could also respond to problems as the data kind of said there might be a problem. So I think if you consider your medium-term connectivity needs, there might be good reasons to invest in the background fiber, wireless networks, or LoRa or similar, because it could then make it much easier and to de-risk future deployments. So I realised that was quite a lot in a quite short space of time, but I hope you found that quite a useful summary. Our experience is that not all pilots work or succeed, but I think even the ones that don't, you learn some good understanding of what the challenges are. I think the ones that did work are the ones where we followed some of the guidelines or the lessons learned that I've just talked about. And I think I'm very happy to answer any questions in the few minutes you have before your next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for your presentation. It was really interesting, and it really taught me a lot about Internet of Things and what it can do and what we can achieve with it. So thank you very much for that. We now have about 10 minutes for questions. So if anybody has a question, and if you're joined by your computer, you can just unmute yourself and speak up. And if you are joined by a phone, you can just let me know as well, and I will give you speaker rights.
Yes, this is Oriol from Sabadell again. Thank you, Adrian, for your presentation. We are lucky to have such an expert in IoT in the project, and yeah, you really show us I think the key points. Just to mention that as Sabadell, under the Triangulum, we are developing actually an IoT platform, which actually using an open source software that was initially implemented in Barcelona, the Centilo platform. And so the idea is exactly what you mentioned, to use these standards, to generate these standards among as many municipalities as possible, and avoid the vendor lock-in. So separate the hardware from the software, and actually make the data be owned by the municipality and not by the hardware provider to some extent. So I think we are a little bit in line with what you are saying. We experience difficulties. That would be a little bit more my question. In convincing the different verticals in the city of the need to integrate into this IoT platform. So as you say, there are many software, many vertical software and hardware, and sometimes the end users don't see the need to be integrated into an IoT platform, into a horizontal IoT platform. They just don't need it, or they think they don't need it. So maybe my question would be, what are the advantages of this horizontal IoT platform? How we can better sell it to the end users, so that they see it is valuable to be integrated into this horizontal platform, instead of just being on the vertical management.
Yeah, well, I'm really pleased to hear that you're doing things with the wider Barcelona. I used to do work with Francesca Bria at Barcelona, who's, I think they're CIO now, and they've always been a really interesting city, and I know there's lots of other things happening in that part of Spain. What I would say is, I talk about a federated system because in Manchester we found that actually, even though the city was running CityVerve and working with Cisco, a large company, to create a kind of standard platform, as soon as you start talking about the needs of smart homes, or air quality monitoring, or monitoring vehicles, there were companies who had very good reasons for having very different systems and very different systems architecture and very different approaches to what was made publicly available. So I think my two bits of advice really would be, embrace that kind of federation, if you like, of different sources, but try and encourage that within your platform, it's where you add value. And add value can happen in two different ways, I think. The first way, of course, is if you combine data from different places, it could actually give you better management information. So your senior managers at the council can benefit from that in terms of planning. So one example there might be, we have a lot of older people in the city. When I say older, people who are over 50 who may be out of work and are not going to be at retirement age now until 67. So how do you get those people who may be off sick or have health problems back into work to get them out of poverty? It might be that the issues are not just to do with their health or to do with their skills, both of which you can address in other ways, but they might live in an area which is poorly connected. Now, if you can combine information from almost like a personal development plan with the transport information, or identify where you have gaps in your transport, so it makes it difficult for people to go to the jobs that are available, and that can give some added value. You know, can see that this is actually one way of improving health, improving economic viability. So by combining data from different sources, that's one example. And the second example, I think, is really many of our services, even ones that are well run, have actually very poor management information and very poor visualization. So, for instance, our bin service is very efficient. I think it quite we've got a good deal with the companies we work with, but we don't always know how we could expand or extend that bin service, how we could actually improve the public realm in the city by making sure there's less rubbish around or having more recycling, because we often don't have the tools to show our senior managers what is there. So I think the thing is, if you can encourage a mechanism by where particular services can see some value of putting their data on the platform. And I think it's also important that although I'm an advocate for open data, there are often good reasons why data can only be made available to a particular service or to particular users. And having that hierarchy of openness, if you like, is another way of achieving your aims.
Okay, thank you very much, Adrian. Oriol, did that answer your question, or do you have any further questions?
Yeah, it perfectly answered my question. I don't know if I have time to add a second question.
I think it's fine. If you have one more question, we can do that. Yeah.
Yeah, my question would be: you mentioned the 5G connectivity. Can you perhaps describe some use cases that can be applied to urban management related to where 5G would be needed? Right? The speed and the reliability of 5G would be valuable.
I think if I could do that, I could probably be £1,000 a day consultant actually at the moment. It's very interesting with 5G because it's new technology. For those who don't really know, 5G really provides the ability to download or upload large amounts of data very quickly. What needs large amounts of data? It tends to be real-time information, or it tends to be where you're trying to visualize something. So I do actually think that the areas where you can most use this will probably be in areas where you have some sort of control, like an airport or a particular city centre space or a hospital. So in other words, an area where you're able to control the connectivity. So it makes it much easier to send information around. So in a hospital, for instance, if you have an X-ray, if you're able to kind of transmit that to anywhere in the hospital via 5G immediately, it might help with kind of health issues. It clearly can help with driverless cars, driverless vehicles, and by providing better real-time information. And you know, I think that's the amount of data points that can be processed at that time. But yeah, I think it's worth bearing in mind that the technology is really just the next generation. The sort of speed of transmission of data can already be achieved by inside buildings, for instance, through good internet connections and through good Wi-Fi. So I think it's actually designing a project or a program that's around some specific needs, where either you need a lot of data to be processed very, very quickly at an end user device, or you're wanting to send high level visualizations very quickly to another mobile device. Those are the two kind of general examples I would give. But yeah, it's an emerging area. The other area I think might be interesting actually is I wonder if there's a connection really between robotics and 5G, because new types of robotics require quite a lot of information. They need machine learning, they need artificial intelligence, and you know, getting that information and processing it very quickly is something that might be something that's useful. So if a factory or a hospital starts using robots, that might be an area as well.
Okay, thank you, Adrian.
Thank you. And also thank you for your entire presentation. So I think if there are no more urgent questions, we will continue with the last presentation of today. And of course, there will also be time at the end of the last presentation if you have some further questions to Adrian or to Vin. So the last presentation of today will be, just a second, will be by Mark Cox, and he will talk about green mobility for and to schools. So Mark Cox is a very experienced project manager and a researcher at the Eindhoven University of Technology. And he is also a board member of the National Dutch Union for Science and Scientists. Currently, he focuses on setting up a business collaboration for the new education system at his university. And his presentation today will talk about green mobility for and to schools. So I think I will just hand the speaker and the moderator rights to Mark Cox, and then you can start with your presentation. So thank you very much already, and you should have the rights to share your screen now, and then you can start. And again, afterwards, we will have 10 to 15 minutes for questions to Mark exclusively, and then at the very end, we will also open it up to the entire round again. So thank you, Mark.
Everybody can understand me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect, okay. Let me introduce myself. My name is Mark Cox. I work at the University of Eindhoven. Sorry for the delay. This morning I traveled to Germany and I entered the university over there, and I was not able to access the network quite easily, which is fixed now. I'm going to give a short presentation on green mobility in Dutch context, actually on behalf of my colleague Pauline van den Berg, who is a specialist on this. So she's a researcher, she's a lecturer on this topic, but she was not able to make it. So I took over. I know her well, I know the topic well, I'm involved in a lot of the projects, so I can tell you some nice things about the projects running or in the Netherlands, but not all details. First, this is a picture of a typical Dutch picture.
Mark,
so
can I interrupt very briefly? We cannot.
Yes, of course.
So maybe if you try to share your screen once more, it might work.
Is it now shared or not?
No, you have to press this middle button next to the speaker button. There is a share screen button.
I did.
You did, and it didn't work?
No.
Okay.
You see it?
No. Ah, no. Yeah. Now we can see it.
Okay, then I go back to the first slide.
Yeah.
This one, opening slide. Okay, then now the second slide. This is a typical Dutch picture in the morning and during lunchtime and in the afternoon. It's a mother with 2 of her children. You see on the back of this bike, there's also a third one, where she's able to put a third child. None of the children is wearing head protection because it's not needed in the Netherlands. And in the morning, you see lots of moms or dads going to school or around schools, delivering their children, and then go to their job. Another one is for the small babies. They have this kind of cars. You actually connect them to your bike, so they're protected for weather and all kinds of things, animals, and you bring your children to school. Of course, this is for children up to like 10, 11 years old. Children from 12 years and older always go by bike, and sometimes they go by train and bus for the large distance, but I think the majority goes by bike. Then the Netherlands is a bike country, of course, just like the Belgians who are addicted to biking. So if you carefully watch the roads, you see a lot of signs referring to bike traffic. So for example, if you have a traffic light, there's always this sign for bikes that they can actually start cycling before the car starts to cycle, or they can turn to the right or left before cars can do it. So there's a lot of exceptions in traffic rules for bikes. In general, that means that that bikes, you have to really take care about bikes. So if an accident happens with a bike, that means that the driver in the car, mostly the car, is always liable. So even people do something stupid with the bike, they go and drive in front of you, or they don't show that they're going in another direction, you hit them, you always are legally liable for that. So that means in the Netherlands, people really take care of people on bikes. That's also one of the reasons why it's quite safe for children to cycle to school just by themselves. So children from like 6, 7 years old cycle to school without parents watching them, and it's safe because everybody knows that if you hit someone on a bike, it's a lot of trouble for the one in the car. I give you some background, and the background is that in the Netherlands, cycling is in the genes. So children start cycling when they're like maybe 16 months, 17 months old. They get their first bike with the wheels on the side. That's that they don't fall to the left or the right. And they start moving and they cycle outside, inside, everywhere until the age of 4. And then the parents may mostly remove the sidecars and children have to cycle without any help. So in the beginning, it's difficult, but it only takes a week actually to go from cycling with the 4 wheels to cycling with 2 wheels. Just one week. Children that are not able to cycle at 5, 6 have really a delay in development, because it will be hard for them to actually learn the tricks about cycling at a later age. The more older you get, the more difficult you get to get the tricks. So the funny thing is that children are not aware of like the risk, so they don't care about what's happening around them, and they start playing with the bike themselves, cycling on one wheel or cycling with their hands in the air, this kind of stuff. And it sounds like a bit strange or awkward that parents allow it. On the other hand, on a later age, because of the skills you develop at a young age, it's very safe to drive in traffic because you can easily change direction, increase speed, decrease speed. It's quite easy. Then I go to the difference in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a flat country, so that means in most of the Netherlands, which is below sea level, the area is quite flat. The only thing is that at the coast there's a lot of wind, and in the real south there are some hills. So if you check the age at what age people are starting to cycle, it's for the most of the country it's about 4 years, except in the south of the Netherlands, the province of Limburg, where you have the hills, slopes up to 10%. You see the children are at 6 till 8 years old. They have actually the skills which in the rest of the country children have at 4 years old. The province wants to change that because it's related to health, of course, and to overweight and to traffic and mobility. But it's very hard. That's probably also one of the reasons why in the rest of Europe cycling is less popular than in the Netherlands. Then on the special legislation and policy for cyclists, I just told before, there's a lot of special legislation and policy for the cyclists to protect them. So in the Netherlands, it's really, really safe to cycle and even do stupid things without people without happening accidents. So for Germans, for example, it's quite strange to see that we don't use this head cap for head protection, but in the Netherlands, people wearing the head protection actually is really funny. People say, why would you use it? Only at very high speed, so up to 40 kilometers and higher, you need this kind of protection. Below, you don't need this protection, otherwise you're not able to cycle, so you should not cycle at all. Then, of course, we have also issues with the bikes. Sorry, that it's parking. If you travel through the Netherlands, you see everywhere, you see bikes and abandoned bikes. And for example, for government, for cities, it's one of the big issues to have abandoned bikes and when to pick them up and when not to pick them up, because it's property of private persons. So you cannot simply just pick it up and sell it or remove it or whatever. You have to do some measures to actually do something with abandoned bikes. So we have these parking lots around the railway stations, sometimes paid, sometimes unpaid. They're safe. What you see is that most of this, for example, students and young people, they use low-cost bikes. So actually the bikes that cost maybe like second-hand bikes, 50 euro, something this range. Then you have the older people that mainly use e-bikes. They're up to like 2,000-3,000 euro. So it's quite a difference in prices and also in how people treat their bike. But what you see in general is a lot around this parking spots, but also, for example, at universities, that every 3 months they have to clean the area because there are a lot of abandoned bikes. Then there's the negative effect of cyclist tsunamis. That's how we call them in the Netherlands. So, for example, if you go to Amsterdam and the traffic light goes to green, it's not the cars that start moving, it's like hundreds of bikes that start moving. And they not move after each other because that would not be effective, but they move next to each other. It's really like the tsunamis were like 5 to 10 bikes coming at you. Of course, this is not a legislation, so sometimes it gives real trouble, like who has now the right to turn left or right, or and that can be an issue. But this is mainly in the big cities. So in Eindhoven, it's not really a big issue, but for example, Utrecht and Amsterdam, it's really an issue. So it says one of the negative effects of the successes of bikes and green mobility in inner cities. Then what we see the last years is that there's a development in bikes. So legislation in the past just allowed bikes and motorbikes, nothing in between. But now you see like e-bikes, and e-bikes are actually, we see them as manually driven bikes because the system just supports the bike itself. So it's different than when you have an engine and the engine is run by control and not by your legs. So that means e-bikes are limited to a speed of 25 kilometers an hour, just like a normal bike. But in the meantime, people also discovered that this type of bikes are really useful for going to your job or doing sports or whatever. So they use sport bike with electric driven engines. But that means that they belong to another group inside legislation. And for example, the pedelecs, they can go up to 40 kilometers an hour. They need insurance, they need kind of license plate, you need a helmet. For e-bikes, this is not necessary. So you can drive an e-bike without any insurance, any license, any helmet, not an issue. So a large development is going on in the bike spectrum. Then I come to the point of hacking, sharing, and leasing. What you see now is that e-bikes are actually electronically driven machines. So although they're limited by law to 25 kilometers an hour, you see that hacking is quite easily done by young people. So they hack these devices and they remove the speed limit, and then they start doing races with e-bikes. Of course, this was not the intention of the law and of the industry, but it happens more and more. For young people, it's fun. Also, one of my children was doing this kind of stuff. The other thing is that sharing of bikes. Bike sharing is becoming very popular in the Netherlands. It's everywhere available. It's cheap. It's easy. It's nice. So in the past, it was a system that was not very commonly used, but now more and more people use it. Instead of going by car, you simply use the public transport and then share a car or hire a car, a bike, and then go to a meeting and return it where you picked it up. Another point what we see now popping up very soon in large scale is leasing of bikes. So for example, in Eindhoven we have a company that is called Swap Bike, and that's leasing bikes for €12 a month to students, and that's including maintenance, insurance, everything. So for students it's quite a cheap way of having a decent bike that is covered by insurance, that is maintained, and it's also like numbered. I don't know if it's also tagged electronically. Most of these systems are, so they can easily be found if they're lost or stolen. So there's a large development going on. All to stimulate green mobility inside the cities and avoid traffic jam. Then one of the negative sides, which happened last year, was an accident with what we call a stint. And a stint was a car, actually it was a kind of a bike which was intended for more children. So for example, for 8 to 10 children. But it was driven by, for example, a woman leading a daycare. And what happened is that something went wrong in the control, and we don't know, or the government didn't find out if it was the control technically, or it was a mistake of the driver. But this thing came run into a train, and lots of children in this stint died. So what happened then is immediately all development in this bike developments were stopped. So that means at that point for half a year, everyone working on bike development, and it can be like e-bikes, motorbikes, stint, had to stop. So a lot of startups working in this business were killed at that point. Now the government said, well, we know almost what the cause was. We know also how to mitigate it. Legislation was adapted, and now people can again start doing their development and introduce new concepts of bikes into our society and industry. Then policy and legislation development. On the police, for example, there's also something which should be mentioned. In the Netherlands, a police officer is, whenever he sees that someone doing something wrong, he's not obliged to give you a fine, or he can also give you like a warning without any consequences. That makes it quite actually easy for people to make mistakes in traffic, and police will stop you. They will have a nice talk to you, but you won't get a fine, you just get a warning, and then up you go. Of course, if it happens too much because your name is registered, you get a fine anyway. But in general, police is very like easygoing. In Germany, it's a bit different, for example. If you dare make a mistake, also in traffic with a bike, then police will stop you and give you a fine. So the risk of using a bike in the Netherlands is really, really low. People start at a very, very young age, cycle also until a very old age. So people of 80 cycling is quite common, it's very common. For example, my parents are 80 years old, they're still cycling. So it's in the nature of the Netherlands and the Belgians. And now I'm going to give you some background because the presentation was originally presented by my colleague on the acceptance of bikes and e-bikes. So my colleague is called Pauline van den Berg. She's a researcher on this topic. She works on mobility and mainly on the social part of mobility. One of the things we tried actually to find out how society reacts is if you want to have more bikes, one of the issues is that more and more people buy e-bikes. And even more e-bikes are sold by industry than regular bikes, also among young people. But one of the things for an e-bike is that you have to charge it like once a day, once in 2 days. So the idea was if we just let the bike recharge itself by adding PV cells in the bike. And originally it was in the front wheel, but later on we also applied it to the frame of the bike so that it was not in the front wheel anymore. And see if this would improve the acceptance of bikes in general in society. And the reason for this is that you want to increase this is of course that we have polluted cities, fires, smoke, traffic jam, all negative effects on society. And the bike is really healthy because you move your body, you burn energy, you don't use the road as intense as a car does, and so all positive effects. So then to the background, Netherlands is a very, very small country. So I think the largest distance you can drive in the Netherlands is about like 300 kilometers. It's not really a big country, so Dutch people don't travel that much and that far. And average commuting distance, so for traveling to your work, is about 17.5 kilometers. And most people, if they have to travel more than 5 kilometers single way, they take a car. Except if the road is suitable for going by bike, or you have this pedelec, and sort of faster bike, then you go by e-bike. And government wants to get more people out of the car on the bike. So that things have to change. And one of the things they're changing, for example, is the biking lanes. The biking lanes differ from province to province in the Netherlands. And for example, in the southern province, the bikers are mainly people on this fast sports bike. While, for example, in the mid or like Brabant, it's more people who work cycling on a regular e-bike. That means that there is a speed difference in both type of bikes, but also it means that the need for space for people passing by each other is also different. So in Brabant, they have a kind of like a policy or legislation for biking lanes. They should be, I think, at least 3 meters in width, and in the south of the Netherlands, it's far less. So still, also the different provinces in the Netherlands are trying to figure out where should this lead to, how should we provide the right infrastructure to actually motivate people to take a bike instead of a car and make it more comfortable for them to go to their job. Another reason in the Netherlands is that there's an increase in overweight. Serious overweight is about 10%, 40% are overweighted. So that means half of the people has overweight. That's a trend around the world, so not only in the Netherlands. One of the things we could do is to have more movement. So instead of taking a car, take a bike in the morning, take a bike in the evening, take a bike to school. And so my colleague has this funny sentence: this one runs on fat and saves your money, this one runs on money and makes you fat. I believe in this. I think it's true. Of course, one of the issues in the Netherlands is that the weather conditions are not always that friendly. Although we have not like freezing conditions, hardly any in the Netherlands. Like 7 or 8% of the time it's raining, and it's not very nice if you go to your job and arrive at your office completely wet. So one of the issues is, for example, this rain, this weather conditions, wind also. People are working also on like a new type of bikes that can solve that kind of solutions. So it's more like a single driven car, but driven by your own power. But it's all about bike acceptance. And bike acceptance is related mainly to social behavior and local culture. So when she did her first research a couple of years ago, it was about how can we encourage people to use a bike, and which factors influence a person's choice to use a bike, and what are the negative effects. And they can be very regional, these negative effects. So the model is bike acceptance in the middle, and then actually you build a model around it. And I'm going to go briefly through this model, like product specifications. For example, some people, they like a bike that looks very expensive with a nice design. Some people just say, as long as it's cycling, it's cheap, and it's good bringing me from A to B, it's good enough. Then the built environment. If you have cycling roads that are in good condition, that they're safe, not too many slopes, you have parking available at the end of your route, and all kinds of services, then people also are encouraged to take a bike. Same for image, comfort, and safety. If the user perception is, my image is okay, it's comfortable, and it's safe, they will actually easily take a bike for going to their job and bring their children, because it's not only for yourself, it's also your user perception when you're transporting your children to school, or when the children are cycling themselves to school. The personal characteristics, so your age, male, female, education, and culture, are also very important. A lot of people in the Netherlands are not from Dutch origin, so lots of them don't have the experience that starting cycling at a young age of 2 years old. So they're a bit behind on that. That makes it very tough for them when they are in dense traffic to respond to fast changing situations. So your personal, actually again you come to user perception, social part is very, very important for taking or not taking a bike, or allowing your children to go to school by bike, or don't allow your children to school to bike. Then mobility. Mobility is related also to travel distance and motive. So your motive can be, for example, you go to school, deliver your children, and then go to your job. But also for just for fun, you go cycling for fun. This all affects the bike acceptance. Then she did a lot of research on the topic, quite a lot, just in the Netherlands. She originally lives in Belgium, which is also a cycling country. And what we found out, there's a large difference in how people respond to bike acceptance related to age. Actually, the family conditions, the money they earn, so the educational level, all this affects the relation between people and their bike. But in general, I could say that most people, almost everyone, has at least one bike in the Netherlands and cycles at least 1 week. If I remember well, average cycling distance for a person in the Netherlands is about like 2,000 kilometers a year, standard. So she did a lot of research on that. We had a lot of experience in how do we do research, and it's a combination of social research and technical research. And we use this for actually developing new products with industry, solving problems for our government, local government, regional government, but also predicting, for example, market shares of bikes. It was a very brief presentation, but if you have questions, you can ask them now.
Thank you very much, Mark. So now we have a few minutes for questions directly about green biking or green mobility.
Yes.
Okay, so okay, Oriol, go ahead.
I will break the ice. Yeah, thank you, Mark, for your presentation and also for your sustained support to our implementation strategy under Triangulum. Yeah, well, just to comment that we put this topic because under our follower seat implementation strategy, we have this action, which is improving mobility, green mobility from and schools. And the idea was to give, or the original idea was to give actually bikes to school children or teenagers, and track how they use this bike, and then offer rewards for those that are using more the bike. What that could be, for example, that in the end they can get the bike permanently. It's not a sort of only temporary leasing of the bike, but they can for those that are more engaged, they can get the bike for them. So, well, the question could be, what do you think? What if that's a suitable action, and also combined with, and I refer now to the first topic of visualization, combined with this VR bike project, like showing through a more educational action, through virtual reality, show how to bike safely to these school children. So it would be, what would you think about it?
Well, I know that in the Netherlands, a large insurance company actually also did the same, this VR biking. Also for the groups that are less connected to biking. So for the Netherlands, I would say like 95% of the children are like born on a bike. Yeah? So they start when they start cycling when they're 2 years old. But for the small group, and of course they're quite vulnerable. So if you start at a later age and you go into traffic, it's much more dangerous. But I know also from experience that if you young children, you give them a bike, for them it's like a toy. They start to do funny things with the bike, but actually it helps them to control it. And later on, when they go in traffic, you always have this unexpected car coming, or this unexpected braking that is needed, and then they quickly respond to it. So I think it's a very good proposal to do this as an experiment, and I think the output will be very successful.
But you mean combining both the VR with the
VR? It's two different things. It's two different things. Yeah, so the easiest way would be like, for example, for the VR thing, it's related to cost. So I would say, just like else, connect to an insurance company. They will do the work. They will do the cost and everything because it's their thing. You will have the benefit. Society will have the benefit, but it's their kind of workload. And the same is for if you have the bikes, for example. You have companies doing this bike renting, bike leasing. It can be very cheap. Like I told you, for example, in Eindhoven, it's like €12 a month, a bike. You can borrow a bike, it's insured, they will come and repair it if it's broken. €12 a month for one bike. So it's very easy of doing such an experiment without too much cost or without too much risk.
Okay, thank you.
I also have one question. So you said that in the Netherlands you don't need to wear a helmet. Does this not lead to a lot of more tragic accidents that could have been prevented, or maybe would have been less bad if people would have been wearing helmets? Is that not an issue?
That's of course, accidents happen. Of course, and if you run over by a car, a helmet won't protect you at all. But because of the low speed and people are common to cycling, it wouldn't help. So, for example, if I'm cycling and something will happen, I will probably break my arm because of the falling. Nothing will happen with my head.
Okay.
So if you see accidents, it's always people breaking like a shoulder or an arm, but never something to the head. Maybe something on the face, a little bit of damage.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is that it's socially not accepted. So if I would start cycling in my village with a helmet on my head, everybody would say Mark is crazy.
Okay. And one other question that's related to that. If children start learning to bike at a very young age, is there something like an official driving school for biking where they also learn about the traffic rules? Like that's how it is in Germany. Like when you are in elementary school, you have to go to this kind of bike school, and then you get your biking license, and then you are allowed to cycle on your own without your parents to school. Is there a similar system in the Netherlands?
No, in the Netherlands it's completely different. Is that they get lessons about traffic rules at quite a young age, but they just get it so not in real life. So they get it in class.
Mm-hmm.
They tell about traffic rules. They give examples about things. Actually, the parents are always responsible, and they can always allow or not allow a child to travel. So if I, as a parent, allow my child of 4 years to travel on the public road, it's my responsibility, and I'm pretty sure that all the cars driving on this road will take care and see this child and take some distance, slow the speed, so nothing will happen. So a lot of people cycle to school with children of 4 years old. And they get a kind of like, it's not a kind of license, but what they do is with the government, the local government, is that they do a kind of test when they're like, I think, 11 years old. And they have to cycle a big route through the city. And then all schools do this. And then at different spots inside the city, the police is actually sitting there and watching the children. All the children will have a number on their back in the front, so they can see, oh, this child is cycling well, this was not looking to the left when he was turning, taking a turn, this kind of things. And what you see then is that like maybe one child in 200 or so will not make it. And when you go into the detail, then this one child that was like coming from another country. So that's quite logical.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
It's not official. It's not that you get a paper and it gives you some rights. It's more like it's like a test to verify that everybody knows how to behave in traffic, but it has no legal status.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes?
Does
Okay.
anybody else have a question? We can also open it up to questions regarding the first and second presentation by Vin and Adrian. So if there are any like general questions left, please feel free to ask them now.
Just perhaps, Muriel, just perhaps another question related to Adrian's presentation. You mentioned that, of course, connectivity is a crucial factor, and that the networks are sometimes many times owned by private operators. How to deal with that? For example, in Sabadell, there is some public network of optical fiber and also WiMAX network. It's only covering a really small part of the city, and the rest is mainly operated by the private companies. So for many of the sensors we rely on 3G provided by private companies, and also we don't use that much, for example, the private fiber for those IoT devices who are in the public space. So what would be your recommendation on these connectivity networks? How could we improve and save money is possible?
Yeah, I think the last point is probably the key one. The save money. For instance, our CCTV cameras in city. I think they use one of our big national providers as one of the ones that, and so it's the ongoing costs of that telecoms connectivity that costs us money. It's very difficult. In the UK, we have got very much a private sector-led approach, and although it's very competitive at a consumer level, what we find within kind of city services is that you often have a local monopoly or limits to what you can do because you are reliant on the network providers. I think we could probably do more in terms of buying wholesale, just as companies like giffgaff buy from the people who run the 3G networks. They don't own the network themselves, but they end up as a reseller. I think the public sector could probably benefit from that. I think reality-wise, it's looking at where we're putting in new networks. You mentioned WiMAX is a good example. Is there a benefit in the install and ownership of that being at a local level? Of course, even when those things are installed and owned by the city, there's still a cost around the managing of it, and it's likely we would franchise that to be managed by a kind of third party. So there's no real one answer, but what I would say is that most of our mobile companies, most of our telecoms companies, they really realise that the investments in their network are substantial, but also that the demand on them is very high, and anything that kind of can improve the mix of connectivity in your city and possibly take demand off the existing networks, in other words, onto Wi-Fi or onto fibre or onto local networks, can actually be beneficial. So I think it's a long-term approach, really, that we need to have. In Manchester, we've been encouraged by central government to invest in fibre. There's a big fibre tender going out at the moment. and that's fibre particularly to publicly owned buildings, including health buildings. But one of the 10 local authorities has actually set up a few years ago a more cooperative model where every time that they would invest in fibre, it becomes part of the cooperative. So there's different models out there really, but for me, I think it's providing, trying to encourage as much investment in connectivity in your city as possible, and then that gives you some choices and you're not just reliant on one provider or one solution, which can be quite expensive.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. Okay. Then I would like to thank you all for participating in this presentation today, in this webinar. My special thanks goes to the three speakers, Adrian, Mark, and Vin. So thank you very much for preparing the presentations and taking some time out of your day to be here and present and answer all the questions. As I said in the beginning, the webinar has been recorded and it will be uploaded to the Triangulum website as well as our YouTube channel. Thank you also to Sabadell, especially to Oriol for participating, asking so many questions and being really involved. And we will also have another webinar for our follower city Leipzig, which will have a similar focus, so they will be able to suggest topics that they are really interested in. And we will announce this in time at our website and also via our Twitter channel. So please just follow us on social media and you can make sure to be informed about upcoming webinars as well. So thank you very much again to all of you, and see you hopefully next time again. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Bettina, for organizing it.
Thanks all.